You know, when I was a kid, I used to go down to the local game store and I would go into the bargain bin and just dig around, find a random game that was super cheap to see if it was any good or not. Because aside from that, I would stick with only titles that I knew, like Final Fantasy, Street Fighter, those kind of games. And for that reason, there's a whole lot of PS2 games that I'm still going back and finding that are very, very good to this day. Bujingai is of course one of these games that I found in the bargain bin all those years ago. Now as a kid, I remember liking it quite a bit. But then again, I was pretty stupid as a kid. And firstly, you must be asking, what exactly is Bujingai? Well, it was a game released for the PS2 in July of 2004 in the US, as Bujingai the Forsaken City. Set in the 23rd century, Bujingai begins 100 years after an incident involving some type of energy that annihilated a majority of the planet's population and practically all of its environment. Those who survived found themselves with special abilities, and most honed it into magic and swordplay. Lao Wang, the game's protagonist, returns to the planet, and no, you're never told why he left or how he left, to find his former friend possessed by an evil spirit and has abducted the game's love interest, Yofa. And Lao stands to be the only one to be able to fix the situation. You're given all of this information right at the beginning of the game, and aside from running into your cohorts from time to time through levels, the plot practically doesn't exist. An interesting part of this game is how it starts. The game starts completely different from most games in that you basically create the intro yourself. You play through a set course for a certain amount of time, and everything you do will be mashed up into a title sequence for the game, which I think is really unique. But since it's likely going to be your first time playing and you don't know any of the controls, 9 times out of 10 your title sequence is going to end up looking kind of crap. Now, after the tutorials and after all the gameplay has been explained to you, it's actually pretty cool. Simple hack and slash style gameplay is represented with a visual flair as Lao's attacks are very, very flashy, to an almost obnoxious extent. You can even pose after combos if you want to be a dick to your enemies. The control system here is pretty simple, yet there's plenty you can pull off if you really think about what you're doing. Mashing your way through the game is an idea, but there's plenty of ways to dodge, counter, and parry your enemies to require a bit of thought depending on the type of enemy you're facing. Placed every so often in levels, you'll find yourself in a duel with an elite-type character, or perhaps even a boss. Here, enemies can counter you just as much as you counter them, so you have to balance blocking with countering with your swords in order to win. These battles are pretty fun and sound challenging, but it's actually pretty simple once you get the flow of it down. It works well until near the end of the game, where they'll throw a curveball and have you duel multiple enemies at once. Good luck. That part sucks. One key to getting around is the platforming. You'll be running to and from a lot, but to get collectibles and get around levels, you'll have to run on walls, glide through the air, and know how to traverse the landscape properly. In thought, this sounds pretty cool. A warrior with unfathomable abilities, walking up a wall and gliding to and from just because he can. But in fact, this is the worst and weakest part of the control scheme in the game. Most of the time, the controls for this is simply unresponsive, with there being an almost full second delay between when you hit the button and when you glide. You have to memorize that timing, or you'll end up with a few more deaths than you anticipated. It won't get in the way too bad until near the end of the game, where one of the last levels is completely dedicated to platforming. I guarantee you that the unresponsive controls will make you want to go play in traffic by yourself. And I can honestly say that I was screaming at my television in rage. And in case you couldn't tell by now, the animations here are really good. All your combos look so natural, and rightfully so, as all of the movements were motion captured. Lao's model being based off the Japanese music icon Gact, whom you might know for also having his likeness in the game Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII as Genesis Rhapsodos. And if you didn't know that Gact modeled him, well, don't worry. They slam it in your face in the intro, the credits, and if that's not enough for you, well, once you beat the game, you can play as him. Because, shut up. The graphics for Bujingai were pretty damn good for a PS2 game. Its visuals were top of the line, character designs were solid, the effects involved were good, and it stayed at a solid 60 frames per second no matter what was going on screen. The levels were all unique, none of them seeming the same, but they're also very linear, leaving them pretty bland and boring in the end. For 2 years in development and only a handful of levels, you'd think there'd been a bit more to each one. The soundtrack's pretty simple, and I liked it, sounding more like a blend of traditional Japanese music with a more rock sound to it. The music suits the game well enough, but they tend to get a bit loopy and they get old pretty fast. The game itself can actually be completed in about 5 hours. I completed it in that time, and that was after about an hour and a half on the platforming stage of hell. It's a brief experience, but once you beat it, you do tend to feel good after conquering its controls. All in all, Bujingai is a fairly solid game. It's not spectacular by any means, but it's certainly above average. The fighting mechanics are simplistic yet surprisingly deep if you give them a shot, but at the same time, those same controls can ruin your fun with its unresponsiveness and moving around. While visually pleasing to the eye, overall the level design's pretty bland, with a strange bit of linearity that restricts how effective the wall running and gliding around really is. While Bujingai does have its issues, there's enough good things about it to warrant a playthrough, especially for you masochistic types out there, and you know who you are. Strangely enough though, as well as this game sold, I feel like I'm the only person that's actually played it. Every time I ask anyone else if they have, they've never even heard of the game. And finally, for those of you that absolutely need a rating, I give Bujingai the Forsaken City a 7 out of 10.